Yep, welcome everyone. I'm really happy to see so many of you here. This is a joint seminar of the Biodiversity Center and the Forest Health and Biotic Interactions Research Unit, but it looks like we've had more response from biodiversity, which is perhaps not surprising given the topic. But anyway, it's really good to see so many here, especially given that there's another biodiversity event in Davos. So there are quite a few who sent apologies who couldn't come. So before I hand over to our speaker, just briefly, my name is Eckhard Brockerhoff, in case you haven't seen me yet, especially folks in biodiversity may not all know me. But so I'm the head of the research unit for Forest and Biotic Interactions here at WSL. And I'm mainly an entomologist, but I have broad interests. So I've also worked on birds a fair bit, and especially interactions between birds and insects and forest structure, etc. And so that interest has led to a connection with Gilberto Pasinelli from the Vogelwarte, the Swiss bird observatory in Sempach. And we've co-supervised a postdoc project by Marco Basile on bark beetle populations and woodpeckers. And Gilberto is a woodpecker expert. He's done his PhD at the University of Zurich on woodpeckers, or various aspects of woodpeckers. Then he's been in the US doing a postdoc at Virginia Tech, came back to the University of Zurich as an Ober assistant. And then he joined the Swiss Bird Observatory, the Vogelwarte Sempach, where he is now the scientific director. And we also have a connection there because Kurt Bollmann's involved with the board, I think, of the Bird Observatory. And I think Rolf also had some involvement there. But without further ado, I should hand over to Gilberto and his presentation of mice, predators, and songbirds, ecological relationships in an unpredictable world. Gilberto.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ecki, for this very nice introduction and for the invitation in the first place. Welcome, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today and to see so many people attending the talk. If you're expecting now to talk about woodpeckers, I have to disappoint you, unfortunately. There will be a woodpecker in the presentation, but it will not be the main topic today. Yeah, okay, let's get started here. Here we go. So, yeah, the presentation will be about mice, predators, and songbirds. We have been studying that system for about 15 years at the Swiss Ornithological Institute. In my opinion, it's quite a fascinating system, as you will hopefully also recognize during the talk and be convinced at the end of the talk that it's really worthwhile studying this system. So forests in general are considered to be stable and long-lived ecosystems. Without human influences, and in the absence of disturbances, such as fires or storms, their structural characteristics remain constant from year to year. Nevertheless, we also know that forest ecosystems can be also quite dynamic. At irregular intervals, for example, we have these mass production of tree seeds, and such mass seeding events constitute what is called resource pools, whatever. These pulses have consequences for a variety of organisms living in these resource pools-driven ecosystems. And an example that has been quite well studied are forest inhabiting rodents, seed-eating rodents. As an example here, a study from North America showing the abundance of rodents on the y-axis and the oak mast index on the x-axis. And as you can easily recognize, in years where there has been oak mast in the previous year, we will have a higher number of rodents in the forest in the next fall. This is due to a better overwinter survival of these rodents, and in addition to an earlier start of reproduction, so they can build up these populations early in quite high numbers after a seed mast. Yeah, but again, apart from these irregularly occurring resource pulses, forests are stable ecosystems. This is especially true for forests that are not influenced or hardly influenced by humans, as for example, national parks. This is a picture of Białowieża National Park in northeastern Poland. And even in these really stable conditions, from one year to the next, there is no forest management and so on, we can have surprisingly fluctuating population trends of some species. This is the population trend or the time series of the wood warbler, which has been studied by Tomasz Wesolowski and colleagues for a long time. And as you can see, population numbers can be dramatically low in specific years, which is surprising given the stability of the ecosystem. The thing gets even more interesting if you plot into this figure the time series of the rodents, of the forest mice. And then you can perhaps recognize that in some years we have high rodent abundances, while at the same time we have a low number of wood warblers present. And so the question comes up, are the wood warbler abundances somehow related, causally or not, to these rodent abundances? The habitat of the wood warbler is generally speaking just forests, mixed broadleaf forests, coniferous forests sometimes as well. In Europe, it's a European species, and these broadleaf forests and coniferous forests, they are characterized by these seed masts that I mentioned earlier, these irregular seed masts. And these have an effect on the rodent populations, which in turn then affect their predators, so the mammalian predators of the rodents. And this setting was somehow at the start of our investigation in 2010. We wanted to know what the possible consequences of these unpredictable conditions caused by the seed mast events are for the population ecology of this long-distance migrant, for the wood warbler. Initially, we focused on the settlement behavior, but we elaborated and extended the project to include other parts of the population ecology of this and other species as well. And the idea that was also of great interest, at least to me, and it still is, as you will see, what are the cues, if any, that are used by these birds when they arrive from migration in spring to decide whether or not to settle in these forests with many or without rodents? Are there such cues? The second aim that somehow triggered this study was these population trends, which are quite negative at the European level and also at the Swiss level. And at the Vogelwarte Swiss Ornithological Institute, we also aim to study exactly such species, which are national priority species, for example, or which are red listed, in order to find out via our research projects something that can perhaps be used in the conservation and promotion of the species. So the topics today, the project, as I said, has been running for 15 years and there is lots to tell, and I try to be within time. Perhaps I will not manage. I focus on 4 topics today: what factors affect settlement behavior, what are the culprits who causes nest predation in these birds, what are the relations between mast seeding and population trends, and finally, are there any consequences for forest management as far as our results can be used to inform forest management decisions? Just briefly, a couple of words about the wood warbler. As I said before, it's a migrant, a migratory species that overwinters somewhere south of the Sahara. When they arrive back in mid-April in our latitudes, they have the challenge to find the suitable breeding sites. So at the beginning, they just select the forest at the landscape level, and then they dive into these forests and ideally find such a place as you see here on the left-hand side, a very nice beech-dominated forest with a special structural characteristics, as you will see shortly. And important to know is that this wood warbler is a ground nesting species, so they build the nests on the ground. A silly thing, you might think, but there are quite a lot of species that do that. And this has, of course, some consequences. We did the study primarily in northwestern Switzerland, in the regions of the Jura Mountains, Canton Basel-Landschaft, Solothurn, and Jura. And at least as important as having good study sites are capable people that do all the fieldwork, which is enormous. Michael Gerber and Alex Grendelmeyer, shown on the left, were very adventurous at the beginning. They somehow started the project with their master thesis projects in 2010. We didn't know at that time how difficult or easy it is to work with that species, how many do we find the nests, and so on, so on. And they just jumped into that challenge, and because they worked so well, laid the basis for the next 14 years and maybe some more years in the future. After the master thesis, Alex went on to do a PhD in Bern, and when he finished, Shannon Lüpold took over as a next PhD student at the University of Zurich. Yeah, well, they all look very happy here on these pictures, and it's good that they didn't know at the beginning. They didn't know at all what was coming their way. And if you just look at some of these pictures, it's really challenging, because even though we didn't work in the Swiss Alps, the Jura Mountains can be surprisingly steep. And it's exactly there, in these steep hills, where the wood warblers like to breed. And yeah, you can perhaps imagine that it's challenging to climb up the hills there, but you really grasp it only when you stand in the middle of these hills. But yeah, I don't go out there too often for several reasons. Anyway, let's come to the results. What factors affect settlement? First, we looked a little bit at the habitat structure influences or potential influences. These are results based on the thesis of Michael Gerber and then later on also of Nika Huber. Initially, the design of our study was quite simple. We had territories where we had wood warblers, also real wood warbler territories, where we measured a couple of habitat features, and we compared these habitat features to control areas, random territories about 200 meters away, so really on a small spatial scale, where we did the same habitat measurements. And the main results are summarized here in this table. So real territories have a higher number of grass tussocks on the ground. They have a higher number of trees than the control sites. Ground vegetation coverage, aside from the grass tussocks, is average or medium. And the nests are, as I already mentioned before, preferentially located on steep slopes, or the territories in this case. Then Nika Huber took over with her master thesis project at the ETH, together with WSL. We were really fortunate to have big support by Christian Ginzler and by Felix Kienast at that time to make a really nice study using remote sensing techniques, LiDAR in this case. And Nika compared just the structure in these control territories and the real territories, and she found that the stand height is intermediate in these wood warbler territories, while the vertical diversity inside the forest, so below the canopy, as well as at the canopy level itself, is smaller than in the control areas. So these are relatively, these are forests that have a relatively poor vertical structure inside the forest. This is what this result actually means. Canopy closure is high. We already knew that from Michi Gerber's thesis, and again, steep slopes, that's what they like. Yeah. Many words. Let's have a look at a couple of pictures. On the left, you see two situations that show suitable habitats. As you can easily recognize, there is a little bit of ground vegetation necessary for the wood warblers. They build their nests in these grass tussocks to hide them a little bit from predation. And on the lower left picture, you see this open stem space that they really like to have. A forest must have such open stem space, otherwise it will not be colonized by the wood warblers. Trees are not very tall. They can be a little bit taller than in this picture, but the canopy closure must be really high, around 80%. And this, summing up this, I think one of the main conclusions is that what we usually have here nowadays in the Swiss lowlands or in the Mittelland, this Dauerwald, I'm not sure if that's the correct term, permanent forest, is exactly not what the wood warbler likes, because you have too many vegetation layers from the ground up to the canopy level. And on the other hand, they also don't like very much these so-called Hallenwälder, the hall forests. This is an example, because that's structurally then, again, too poor. We hardly have ground vegetation cover. That's what they don't like. And they sometimes still need some small twigs or branches that come out of the trees, where they sit down for their singing flights or before they approach the nest. So that's another important structural feature that is lacking in these whole forests, in these Hallenwälder. Okay, of course, habitat factors are one of many types of factors that can affect settlement behavior or something else in the ecology of a species. We also were interested to look a little bit at social factors. So when you are in a foreign city and you are looking for a place to eat in the evening, at a conference, for example, you will make a choice based on several criteria. These may include, for example, the type of cuisine. Perhaps you like Italian, as I do, or you'll consider the location, the outward appearance of the restaurant, and so on. But perhaps equally important is the social context. A well-occupied, well-frequented restaurant, a busy restaurant, is probably more appealing to you, more attractive. There seems to be something about the restaurant that draws the people inside. Whereas on the other side, on the right-hand side, this is a relatively sterile restaurant, I would say. It's probably would not be my first choice. So probably we just also take into account the social cues when we make our decisions, for example, in terms of foraging. And in the animal world, this concept has been known for a long time, or for several years before we started our study. It's called conspecific attraction, sometimes social attraction, or there are categories or divergences of this concept. But the key point is that animals pay attention to other animals of the same species and sometimes also of other species. That's basically behind this conspecific, or in the case of other species, the heterospecific attraction concept. Yeah, and we wanted to see if this possibly also is a factor that affects settlement behavior, because there have been studies in the past that somehow alluded to this possibility that this is a semi-social species. It was the topic of Alex Grendelmeyer's PhD thesis, and he used information on real wood warbler territories that were censused in the 3 years before he conducted the experiment. We wanted to know where these territories are, because we wanted to set up the experimental plots in these places that you see here. These red circles are the experimental plots. By this, we wanted to make sure that we really have locations that would be suitable for the wood warbler, in addition to perhaps to the cues that we present them. He set up 29 of such experimental plots, and then he randomly assigned treatments consisting of a song that we broadcasted, wood warbler song that we broadcasted in a couple of these territories, half of them, and then we also had half of the other half was consisted of controls, pigeon songs or silent controls we also used. This was the situation in year 1, and then in next year we switched treatments. As you can see here, if I go back and forth and you just check the labels, then you see they change a little bit from 1 year to the next. So in this case, we could really exclude any other possibly disturbing effects of the environment on our results. And the result, in fact, was really quite clear. So it doesn't really matter which category or combination or year you look at. The number of territories of the wood warblers was always substantially higher on these song plots compared to the control areas. And this is a very nice presentation of the social attraction concept and conspecific attraction. So wood warblers really do pay attention to other individuals that are present when they settle. Yeah, then Shannon Lüpold, she took up that result and looked a little bit further into other factors. She tried to figure out what is the probability that the male, once it has settled, stays in this territory or moves on to another place. And she related this probability of male movement to the mating potential in a given territory. And by mating potential, you can basically say, is there a female that came to the male in the territory or not? If there is no female coming, the male will disappear within a few days. If a female shows up, then there is also a change in the mating potential, because at some point, the females will have laid eggs, and then they are no longer interesting for the males on the territory. The females lay the eggs, not the male, maybe. Yeah. And if this mating potential gets really low, then the probability that the males move away to another location relatively nearby to defend the secondary territory increases quite dramatically. Not all males do that, but about 20 to 30% of the males do it. So mating potential in a breeding territory is important, and then we might also have the situation that a nest has been built, the female has laid eggs, and then at some point the predation sets in. What do the males do after predation? And here the social context is again important, meaning again, is there still a female around? Has she been eaten by the predator, or did she just move away? That's also a possibility. If they move away, the females, or are just not there anymore, then the mating potential in that territory is basically 0 for the male, and they move also away. But if the female stays after mass predation and tries to make a second nest, the males also stay. So it's really the presence of the female that determines a lot of what the males are doing. That's not a new information, I guess. We all know that. Anyway, so we move away a little bit from these social factors and habitat things and go a little bit into a broader scale perspective. Dominik Scheibler did his master project at the University of Zurich and was also much supported by WSL. He wanted to compare patterns of occupancy of the wood warbler in the 90s compared to the 2010s in relation to forest clearings that have been done in between and in relation to nitrogen deposition. And for that, he used data from different data sources from the Swiss Ornithological Institute, and he identified 3 types of kilometer squares. The blue dots show you kilometer squares where the wood warblers had been present in the 90s, but no longer in the 2010s. The green dots are kilometer squares that indicate presence in both time periods, and the yellow dots indicate kilometer square where the wood warblers were not there in the 90s, but have then colonized in the 2010s. Yeah, and if we look at the forest clearings, the results are again surprisingly clear in my opinion. So these kilometer squares that were abandoned between the 1990s and 2010s, these blue dots, they show proportionally more clearings within 100 meters of the territories of these wood warblers. So it's again, on the one hand, a large-scale investigation, but then it narrows down again on the territory level. And territories that were inhabited in both time periods or have been colonized, they had a lower percentage of these clearings that took place in between. Additionally, Dominik also found that in kilometer squares that were abandoned, again, these blue dots, the nearest clearings were significantly closer to the wood warbler territories than in kilometer squares that were always occupied or newly inhabited. So both findings, in a way, suggest that these clearings are kind of important for the wood warbler. If they are too close to a territory or even inside a territory, then they are likely to abandon this territory. The wood warbler are likely to abandon it. The second factor is nitrogen deposition. For a long time, we all know that large amounts of nitrogen have been deposited in forest soils via the air. To a certain extent, forests can compensate this, but if the so-called critical loads, which are somewhere between 20 and 10, depending a little bit on the soil, if these critical loads are exceeded, then profound effects or changes in the forest ecosystem can occur. For example, a strong vegetation growth up to some point, including the ground vegetation and the bushes. We might have soil acidification. We might see changes in the soil fauna and so on. I guess there are a couple of people here in the audience that know a lot more about consequences of nitrogen deposition in forests. But these are factors that might be important for the wood warblers, the ones that I just mentioned. Yeah, and sure enough, Dominik found that in kilometer squares that were abandoned between the 90s and 2010s, again, these blue dots, they showed significantly higher nitrogen deposition rates than these other kilometer squares that were always occupied or had been newly colonized. And in addition, the exceedance of these critical loads in kilometer squares that were abandoned, blue dots, was significantly higher than in kilometer squares that were always inhabited or have been newly colonized between the time periods. Again, both findings suggest that nitrogen deposition is potentially a problem for the wood warbler habitat because it causes vegetation growth that is not favorable for wood warbler settlement. Okay, that's the first point. We can check this, probably. If you think back at the introduction, I'm sure you all have listened quite attentively at the beginning, hopefully now still. You might miss a factor which I was talking about. Yeah, it's the rodents. What are the rodents doing? Do they play a role in our system? Yeah, they sure enough do. This was part also of the master thesis project of Michael Gerber, with the same setup that he used to analyze the structural differences between territories and control areas. He also found differences between rodent numbers. They are substantially lower in the territories than in the nearby control areas. And this is surprising. It still surprises me nowadays when I think of this result, because as I said before, territories and control areas are 200 meters apart. It's a really small scale difference in rodent numbers that is evident in this relatively crude analysis. And it confirms what others have shown based on these population trends in relation to the rodents that I showed at the very beginning. Yeah, and here is perhaps the more sophisticated figure. Occurrence probability of the wood warbler or of wood warbler territories is negatively linked to these rodent numbers. Forest mice, I have to say. Okay, so if this settlement appears to be related to these forest rodents, the mice. So how could this be? What could be the link in the end? Very early on, already in the 1949, a locally famous ornithologist, Fritz Ammann, said mice are the worst enemies of ground nesting birds. That's it. It's so easy. They eat the babies. Of course, the wood warblers want to avoid that, so they don't settle. This was a long-standing hypothesis for a long time, even supported by our colleagues in Poland. And yeah, we just wanted to know a little bit more about these predation events. Are the rodents really the big predators and maybe the cause for these inverse population trends that we have seen at the beginning between wood warblers and rodents? Let me start by showing you the nest predation rates overall. Here you have data from Białowieża, a study that we conducted close to Marburg and from our Swiss Jura Mountains. And as you can see, about 80% of the wood warbler nests in all three study regions are predated annually. So it's a big loss, surprisingly constant. And if you look at the nest failure rate overall, so including other causes of nest failure, we have about 47, sometimes 50, sometimes 55% of all the nests that fail on an annual basis. So these are high numbers, but they are not unusual for ground nesting birds. That's a typical situation that we found in other species as well. Yeah, but who are the culprits? Let's go to the Tatort and have a look what happens really. Here you see all the predator or the predation events that we identified with our trail cameras, the nest cameras that we placed in front of 650 nests almost. And I'm sure that there is one or the other predator that is a little bit surprising to you, that they go after these wood warbler nestlings. And for me, of course, the big surprise, as you can imagine, was this here, the woodpecker. They are known to be predators, that's clear, but that they go down to the ground and take out the nestlings of wood warblers, I wouldn't have believed it if someone had told me that at the beginning of the study. And equally surprising, in my opinion, is the blackbird, which is also not expected to be a big predator in general of nestlings, at least, of birds. Honey buzzard is also a little bit surprising because that species feeds quite often on wasps and stuff like that. Yeah, anyway. Yeah, and what about the rodents? Again, I just ignore them. The rodents, they are there as well. They are not just doing nothing. And if I use my mouse for a second, fittingly, I guess, you have here the nest with the wood warblers in the background. So 3 of these nestlings are peering out. In front is the adult. Pay attention to the date. Now it's 5th of June, and the time is 9:20 in the evening. Just keep an eye on the date a little bit, and also what happens here on the nest, at the nest. So at the beginning, not much is going on, but then, yeah, things start to become dramatic. So it's now 3:45, 4 o'clock in the morning, and they just take out all the nestlings and eat a little bit of each. Probably the best pieces of each nestling are consumed first, and the rest is just left over. And then at some point, the female shows up again, and yeah, or the male, I can't tell that, both feed. And for me, it's surprising to see, and also a little bit sad, of course, to see how persistent they are in trying to feed the nestlings that are no longer there. So they're really strongly attached to these nests when they have nestlings or had nestlings in there even then. It takes a while for them to realize that they have to move on. Now it becomes evening again. It's the 6th of June now. The next batch of rodents or forest mice are showing up. You have these snails. They are always present anyway, and they also sometimes do predation events. Not on a large scale, but they still do. Yeah, this goes on maybe a couple more seconds, and then the female or the male is again visible before everything happened. It turned bad. Yeah, that's the beginning of the movie. So, what does this movie show us? 2 things. One thing is that the rodents, the forest mice, indeed do go after these nestlings. That's good news in a way, because that was expected by many people. And it's also good news for us because it showed that our camera system was able to register these predation events by the rodents, because they are quite fast. But as you have seen, they are running around all the time, and these cameras are quite sensitive. So they are able to spot these predation events. And yeah, what did the rodents do then? If you look at the numbers, out of these 645 nests, only 16 were predated by rodents. That's not a lot, 2.5%. And if you just look at all these camera nests that had been robbed or predated, it was only 6.5% that were predated by these rodents. And for us, this means that nest predation by mice is hardly the direct cause for the avoidance of wood warblers of these areas where you have many rodents in some years and few rodents in other years. Rodents go after the nestlings, but not in very big numbers. Yeah, what we also found then with analysis using part of the data set, that nest survival of the nests decreases over time. That's a pattern that we see in many ground nesting species, in other species as well. So the time is here on the x-axis. That's the nest age in days, of course. But more interesting is that nest survival is significantly or substantially lower in these rodent-rich years. So even if the wood warblers settle in these rodent-rich years, they do it in low numbers, as I said before, but those that do, they get hammered. So they really have low reproductive success. And if you then look at who is actually behind these predation events, you probably have seen it before in these figures, in these pictures. It's primarily these rodent hunting mammals. So they go after these nests, even more so when there are more rodents in the forests. So it seems that these rodent hunting mammals like foxes, marten, and so on, they are attracted to these sites where you have many rodents. They show an increased level of presence on the forest floor. We could document that also with nest cameras that we hung up to see what is the density or an index of density of these mammals. This was quite impressive to see. In contrast, when there are few rodents, nest predation is still there by these rodent hunting mammals, but to a lower extent. And then the other species that you might wonder about is the Eurasian jay. That was a top predator, as you might have seen in the slide before, but that species doesn't show a pattern in relation to the rodent presence on the forest floor. So they do predate the nests, a little bit higher perhaps, but not with good confidence, higher in these years where there are fewer rodents. Well, they're just there and they feed on these nestlings. And regarding the jays, that's also an interesting thing. They were much more common as a predator in the UK, in England and so on, as compared to Poland, for example. There we didn't have one single event of jay predation. So it's a little bit a biased result, a geographically biased result, because the people in the UK have also used quite a lot of these camera traps and have then identified also quite a lot of these jays. In our areas, Swiss Jura Mountains and Marburg, it's about 50-50 between jay predation and rodent hunting mount predation. Yeah, as the marketing specialists have correctly recognized for a long time, a lot of things are eaten in food chains. And this is no different in the food chain in which the wood warbler is included. Okay, let's move on to the next topic, which is mast seeding and population trends. Now, climate change has been influencing the mast seeding patterns of various European tree species over the past few decades, including oak and beech, to some extent. In general, the idea is that these warmer temperatures, perhaps in addition to these nitrogen deposition things, have led to a higher average seed production overall. That's one point, which can also be caused by trees getting older over time. We have older trees, at least in Switzerland, and older trees produce more seeds up to some point. But again, I have to be careful here because there are experts here in the audience who know a lot more about these patterns than I do. But anyway, it has been shown in a couple of studies that also the frequency of mast seeding years has increased over the last decades. And another recent study has shown that there is a decreased variability in the production of these mass events, also meaning that if you have a mast, they are not so big anymore as they used to be. But on the other hand, from the lower side here, you have more seeds that are produced annually, which then creates this decreased year-to-year variability in seed production. And apparently the synchronization is also a little bit lower nowadays than it was before. I find it sometimes difficult. I mean, papers, they come up with some results and others then come up with different results, and to somehow see the entire picture is not so easy. And maybe we can discuss this a little bit later on. But on the other hand, what we can probably see, and what also is sometimes confirmed by foresters, that we have more mast events in some places. And the question for us now was, what do these increasing mast cycles mean for the wood warbler and for other forest bird species? To answer this, we first looked again at reproductive success. In this case, we asked if annual reproductive success, not nest success, but annual reproductive success in terms of number of fledglings per female that are produced, fluctuate with mast seeding across Europe. And this was a study that was conducted by Nino Mag. He was a postdoc in my project for a while. And as you can see here, across study years, the number of fledglings produced per female was lower in years following a seed mast than in years without a seed mast in the preceding fall. The differences were significant only for the two poly study sites at the bottom. They were nearly significant for the Jura Mountains, and they were not significant for the Hessen study area. But this is most likely because we just had data on the reproduction of the birds from 4 years. That's not a really big time series. But the difference at least goes into the same direction as in the other study sites. So given the difference in the reproductive output in years after the occurrence or absence of a seed mast in the previous fall, we asked if and how population growth rate is influenced by reproduction following these mast or non-mast events, and perhaps influenced by other important demographic factors as well. And to answer this question, we incorporated the reproductive values that we found in our different study areas into a female-based pre-breeding matrix population model, which is depicted here by this graph, by this life cycle graph. And the idea was to figure out which of these different parameters, like fecundity, like survival and mast frequency does have the largest impact on population growth rate. Yeah, we did an elasticity analysis to examine this impact of the different model parameters on the population growth rate. And in all study areas, the growth rates were most sensitive to both juvenile changes in juvenile survival and adult survival. So they had the largest elasticity values, which are shown here on the y-axis. Clearly, survival is important. Unfortunately, it's exactly the parameter we cannot estimate because wood warblers are nomadic. They come back. They don't come back from year to year. They settle somewhere else in the next year. And what we can only use here are substitutes, survival estimates from closely related species, willow warblers, which is what we used here. Probably survival is important, for sure it is important, but we cannot really estimate its importance specifically for the wood warbler in a more reliable way, I would say. Then changes in reproduction after mast years and in reproduction after non-mast years, as you can see here, had smaller relative effects in terms of elasticity values, smaller effects on the population growth rates as well than these changes in survival rates. However, one has to note that in one study site in Wielkopolska, WNP, and in Hessen, changes in the reproduction after non-mast years also had a relatively large effect around 0.4, which was unexpected and surprising. Finally, the elasticities for mast year frequency were negative, indicating that an increase in mast frequency leads to a decrease in population growth rates. In absolute terms, these elasticity values are smaller than those for survival estimate, for the survival parameters, and are similar to these reproduction parameters. Okay, so as we have seen, population growth rate is affected at least to some extent by patterns of mass seeding. And the last question that Nino addressed during his postdoc was, therefore, if population growth rate did indeed differ between sites with frequent mast events as compared to sites with less frequently occurring masts. And yeah, we plotted the population growth rates in relation to the mast events that you see on the x-axis. On the left side, you see the situation where masts were still quite rare, one mast every 4 years. And on the other hand, on the other side of the x-axis, we have frequently occurring mast events every 2nd year. And the figure somehow suggests that there is a negative relationship between population growth rates and the frequency of these mast events, although I have to hasten to mention with n = 4, it's difficult to make big statistics. But at least the pattern is interesting, I think. If it's a real pattern, we need to figure out a little bit more in the future. Okay, we have seen that reproductive output is reduced in years following mast seeding events. We have seen that population growth rates are negatively related to the frequency of mast seeding. And if the availability of seeds has really increased, be it because of tree aging, be it because of increased mast events, it means that there is an increasing numbers of years out there in which wood warblers cannot reproduce at high rates. And it's an interesting situation, in my opinion, because these changes in mast seed available in masting patterns and also availability of tree seeds is to some extent a natural thing. Of course, it's influenced probably by climate change, but it's still a natural factor that we cannot really do much against it. And it seems to have at least some effect on the population trends of these wood warblers. Perhaps also explains some of the declines that we have seen in the past and still see nowadays sometimes. However, again, I have to mention really quickly that changes in annual survival of juveniles and adults are the more important factors according to our elasticity analysis. But as said before, it's a little bit a difficult factor for us. What do we know after 15 years? I think we can say that there is a demographically based population response by these rodents. In years after a seed mast, they are really abundant in the forest. This creates a numerical response by these rodent hunting predators. And they are the big predators of the wood warbler nests in these years after a seed mast. You probably are missing a connection between the green arrow or the rodents and the wood warbler. I just let it away because at this stage we cannot really say anything about the direct relationship between these two components of the ecosystem. In my opinion, there is none. It's an indirect relationship mediated by the predators. There are still a lot of things that we do not know. And one thing that is still somehow nagging a little bit inside me, we don't know yet if there are cues that the wood warblers use when they arrive from migration. Apparently, they don't pay attention to the rodents, they don't pay attention to the predators. We did examine this in Marburg with the group of Nina Farvig. We made large-scale playback experiments where we played back rodent calls, and played back predator calls, jays, what have you. But the wood warblers, they didn't care what we did. They just settled where they wanted. So at least acoustic cues don't seem to be the cues that they use when they settle. Maybe it's something completely different. We might discuss that later on. Okay, I have to move on a little bit, come to the last point, consequences for forest management. So these are the forests, we have seen these figures before, these pictures before, that the wood warblers like. High canopy closure, few shrubs and bushes in the understory, low ground vegetation cover, few rodents. And according to Wolfgang Scherzinger, wood warblers' habitats in Switzerland and elsewhere extend from the Schlussphase, the final phase in the forest succession, over the entire optimal phase until the early planter phase. So that's typical, the good habitat that the wood warbler prefer. And the Vogelwarte always tries to somehow put the results of research projects in practice. And we also try to do that here in the wood warbler case. We asked the question if the required forest structures can be created by targeted forest management measures. This was a project led in the field by Karin Feller, and clearly what she couldn't influence, or at least not in a favorable way, is the tree layer. The trees have to be there, a certain density, a certain size of the trees has to be there, but we aimed to remove this shrub and bush layer, which often occurs quite densely close to the ground, and which, as I said before, the wood warblers don't like at all. And together with forest managers, we took out these bush layers, these shrub layers, in areas where we thought otherwise the habitat looks quite good. And here it's the same pictures again. You see on the left the situation where the bushes had been removed by the foresters, and on the right where the bushes are still there. And we had a nice study design. It was a before-after control impact design. We had 9 plots where we did these removal things and 9 plots close by where we didn't remove anything. And before we started the removals, we checked for presence of wood warblers. And as you can see here, wood warblers were really basically absent, if you want to be honest. What happened after the interventions? It was a little bit better in these plots where we removed the understory layer. The numbers, if you compare this number here, 0.25, that's a mean number of wood warbler territories, to the plots, the same plots before we made the intervention. It's not a big increase, it's a 5-fold increase. So you can say, if you want, it's an increase on a low level, but it's at least an increase. It's not bad. It seems that this might be a measure to promote wood warblers in specific locations where also the soil, of course, is beneficial. And but I also have to mention that the proximity of other wood warblers close by seems to benefit the colonization of these areas. That's something we didn't specifically look at here in this experiment, but we have seen conspecific interaction before. Short-term consequences or short-term measures, excuse me, for wood warbler promotion or conservation would be exactly what I just said. Remove the shrubbery close to the ground in otherwise suitable high forests. Mid to long term, it would be good to extend the rotation periods to create these old forest stands which are sometimes lacking nowadays in our landscape. We could also try to maintain islands of old forest stands across the landscape, or natural forest reserves, Waldnaturschutzgebiete, which is actually where we found most of our wood warblers. That's an interesting side result. In the long run, there should be management methods that lead to, I call it age class forest. I know that's a term that's no longer being used very often or well received by many people that work in forestry, but still it creates exactly these type of habitats that the wood warbler likes on a relatively larger spatial scales of several hectares. That would be okay. And I think what we clearly showed in many other results as well, Dauerwald, permanent forestry, that's nothing that the wood warblers like. And if that continues in Switzerland, that species will disappear. I have also to add that these approaches are not just beneficial for the wood warbler. It's a habitat that is specific in terms of its structure. It doesn't occur widely in Switzerland nowadays and elsewhere likewise. And there are still a number of species that benefit from this habitat. I have here listed a couple of bat species and the Gelbringfalter, woodland brown, also quite a rare butterfly species. They occur at least in part of their life cycles in these forests as well. Yeah, with that, I'm at last finished. Apologies, Eki, for taking too long. I would like to mention or thank primarily the sponsors that have supported this project. It doesn't work without money, we all know that, but I also would like to thank specifically WSL, and here Christian Ginzler, Felix Kienast, and Daniel Scherer, who contributed their expertise to various parts of our project, and also their working time, of course, and it was also always a very pleasant collaboration together with them. On the right-hand side, you see a number of people that have been involved in this project, and I apologize if I've missed or forgotten one or the other name. This is quite likely in such a big project. I thank you for your attention, and maybe we still have time for one or the other question. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Gilberto. That was really fascinating. I enjoyed it very much. And I think for all of you here, many of whom work in forests, you can see there's a lot of linkages between forests and all kinds of other organisms that live in forests. And all these interactions, they can be really fascinating and unexpected also. And so I think in this long-term study, it's neat to see how all these things interact and how they can play out, and that there's always more to find out. But we have time for questions. So if anyone has a question, maybe also from Zoom, but we'll do the room here first. Any questions, comments, anyone? Marco?
Hi, Gilberto. Thank you very much. It was very nice. Do you have any results about changes in predation rate from birds of prey? Because in other system with passerines nesting more in canopy, they observed a decrease in predation rate of birds of prey in years of high rodent abundance. Yep. So a bit opposite of what you found, but also because, I guess, because your species nest on the ground, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really a pattern that we observe that is kind of opposite to things that have been shown in the Arctic, for example, with the snowy owls. The problem in our case is that these birds of prey are not that common as predators. So we just don't have enough predation events to really have a look at whether or not it's different between a year following a mast or a non-mast situation in fall. So I can't answer the question, unfortunately. But I can say that these raptors, they are not very common as predators.
Thanks, Gilberto, for the nice talk. as you mentioned, this high rate of nest predation is not unusual. It's very common in ground nesting birds. I was surprised to hear that the male behavior or on territory or off territory depends on the presence or absence of the female after the predation attempt. So do you know where they go? Do they establish a new territory? Or can we conclude, if yes, can we conclude there is more potential territory for the wood warbler in our forest, that there are males that can occupy these territories?
Yeah, again, a great question. On the one hand, we were also surprised to see this pattern, because usually you say when birds lose their nests, they just move away, or maybe they sometimes start another clutch. But in this case, it's really, it was surprising to see that when the females stay and make a second nest attempt, the males invariably stay as well. And if they move, the females, or disappear for whatever reasons, the males disappear as well. We can't really say where they go, because as soon as they leave our study sites, you don't find them anymore. And there are definitely other sites with suitable habitats which we didn't survey in our study. It's just too big. What we know, on the other hand, is that we have many more males that settle in the first place in relation to the females. So, as I also mentioned briefly in the talk, if a male does not get a chance to become paired, or let's put it the other way, if a female doesn't go to a male and gets paired, that male, the unpaired one, will move away within days. And interestingly enough, in the same spot, another male will show up from somewhere, stay there a few days, weeks, sing. If it doesn't get paired, it will go again. You could show that with ringing, bird ringing, individual identification. But where exactly they go, it's as unclear as the other results, or result, no, we don't have result, as the other phenomenon that when the birds arrive in spring and they realize for some reason the situation this year is not good, too many rodents, too many predators, whatever, where do they go? We have no clue.
But do you have evidence of replacement clutches or second clutches?
Yeah, we do have that, limited evidence. In the first years of Shannon's PhD thesis, we attached small radio transmitters that lived just 3 weeks. And we were, I think, lucky in 2 cases to find the displacement of a female, or a movement of a female from one of our study sites to another one, or to another area. But these are really rare cases that we can say something about. And often one also has to think that these predation events occur more often in the nestling stage than in the egg stage, which means that the season is already a little bit late for starting a second clutch, if the nest fails in a stage that is really already a little bit older. Does this answer your question? Okay.
We have here a question in the chat. Alexandra Grobel asks, thank you for your presentation. Is it possible that the warblers use UV reflection from rodent urine as cues, as the raptor does?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for this. That's something we wanted to look at the beginning also. Michael Gerber in his thesis wanted to check that. And on the one hand, that's maybe another topic. This raptor study is being discussed for quite a long time. It's not clear if that pattern really is there. But the other thing that we tried at the beginning, we put out mice urine in the forest, just to make a little pilot experiment. And then Michael Gerber wanted to see if he can somehow measure these urine traces in the forest, the ones that we knew were there, with a sensitive camera, and he failed to do so. And then we somehow moved away from this part of the experiment, also because, as I said before, this raptor result seems to be a little bit ambiguous. And on the other hand, newer studies have shown that it depends a little bit on the habitat. This study that you mentioned, or the person mentioned in Zoom, was done in an open landscape. And in the forest, you have different light situations that change over the day. And apparently, it's then much more difficult for birds to identify such UV traces. it might still be something that we could look at, but probably I would start with an experiment in captivity to see if the birds somehow respond to UV signals.
Perhaps we can have one more question, if there is another question here. Otherwise, I wanted to ask, so you had this social element, you know, the busy restaurant versus the empty restaurant, and you played wood warbler songs, and you found there was greater colonization when you had playback songs. On the other hand, we know male birds don't usually go to male birds singing because that's an occupied territory. So was this more like colonization in the surroundings, or would they actually go in and try to fight it out? Or
yeah, we had some observations where the wood warbler males really went to the playback and tried to fight it. But at some point they realized there's nothing to do. It's stronger than me. But they then still settled in the vicinity of these playback plots. So they didn't settle inside the plots, but in the surroundings of these plots. As you may remember, the experimental plots were 5 hectares in size, and wood warbler territories are really small. They are half a hectare or something like that. So you would have ample opportunity for many males to settle around the playback set. And that's exactly what we saw.
I guess it also makes sense, because if you have males present in a bird that is relatively rare and patchy, there's a greater likelihood that there are also some females around. Then if you don't hear anything, then there are no males, but probably also no females, I guess.
Yeah, the whole thing also runs a little bit into the direction of lacking species. I mean, that's maybe perhaps a little bit far-fetching, but there is this concept of hidden lack, meaning that we don't just recognize a lack when we look at the birds because they have their territories, but they still, at least the wood warblers, seem to do something like that, because they do seem to cluster a little bit. Not like the classic lacking species, of course, but still there is something like a clustered structure. And the question that we couldn't answer yet is, what is the advantage of doing so? We also took blood samples, analyzed patterns of extra paternity, and that didn't help us explaining why they do this clustering. It's really strange. In the end, it's perhaps just simply just better, because where you have more males, you have still a greater chance to get paired with a female or be found by a female.
Thanks. So before everyone leaves for lunch, 2 things. One is that I reserved a table. So if anyone wants to join us over lunch and have a chat with Gilberto and others here who are interested in birds and interactions with other organisms in the forest, you're welcome to join us. And second thing, I also reserved a room. So if afterwards you have a desire to chat a bit more, just let me know and we can organize something. I didn't have much feedback. I know Anita would like to, and so we'll do that. But yeah, so just let us know if you want to join us for lunch. Just hang around and go with us. And so with that, just please join me in thanking Gilberto again for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.